Welcome to the launch of the Actuarial Risk Principles. It's good to see so many people here. I hope you're all interested in finding out a little bit more about what's going on in this area. My name's Matt Gurdon. I sit on the Risk Management Board of the IFOA. I'm also the chair of the newly formed Wider Fields Working Party. And it's in those roles that I've been involved in the Actuarial Risk Principles. So I'm going to speak briefly to introduce the principles, where they came from, what the purpose is. That'll be 10-15 minutes or so, and then I'm going to hand over to our three speakers who are going to present some case studies for us, practical use of the principles. I'm delighted to welcome three excellent speakers here. First, we've got Jasveer Grewal, who is going to speak to us about cyber risk. And then Kevin Wenzel will be talking to us about autonomous vehicles. And finally, Nico Aspinall, who will talk to us about climate change. They're going to do about 15 minutes each. At the end of that, then we'll have about half an hour for questions. So if I can ask you all to hold off on questions until the end. Okay, so how did this all come about? It started actually almost 2 years ago when Nico was preparing a presentation for a World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and that was on climate change. And as part of that presentation, he was going to include some principles around risk management and the way an actuary might approach some of those topics. And he got assistance from Andrew Hitchcock on the Risk Management Board, who helped put together some high-level principles to include in that talk. That went very well. It was well received, and it highlighted that risk approaches that are fairly common to actuaries may not be so common elsewhere and not being used in practice. And it was felt there was some opportunity there for the actuarial profession to remind both its members of risk management and ways we can go about doing that and using that in wider areas, but also to raise the profile of actuaries more widely, to show where we can add value, do something a little bit different, and help with some of the big issues that are around in the world. So the risk board decided to set up a small group to look at this a bit further, and we evolved the initial high-level principles and expanded them slightly and refined them until we got to the document that hopefully you've all got in front of you today. And alongside that, we developed some case studies to go in that to just show the application of the principles, give everybody a feel for what we mean in some of the areas. This being the launch today, hopefully you'll all have lots of questions to ask at the end about how they might apply in areas that you work, or issues that you can see with some of the principles, or in fact where you might be applying them already in the work you do. So I'm going to just very quickly, before I hand over, run through the structure of the principles and what each one is, so that you're ready for the case studies. So you may recognise this type of graph from your studies. It's a bit like the actuarial control cycle. It's very much a familiar type of approach in risk management. It's a cycle, so we expect this to be used and iterated and not just be a static approach to risk management at all. So we split it into four main themes of considering the context, describing the system of interest, measuring the underlying risk, and then deciding how to manage that risk. And in the centre, you see, we're trying to highlight the importance of the communication side of risk management. We often talk about the risk taxonomy, making sure people understand what you mean by risk, what risks you're talking about, and what the potential outcomes are. So it's not just focused on a single bit of information. It's clear explanation, concise where appropriate, with enough information to inform decisions. So there are 12 principles underlying those four main themes. And as I said, they operate in a continual process. It's not a do it once and it's done and forget about it. It's a process that you follow or can follow, and then it will circle back round. You'll get feedback along the way, things will change, and you allow for that within the process. And it's very much focused on the actuarial skill set. So we haven't tried to produce the complete guide to risk management. This document is intended to provide a framework for looking at the actuarial elements or the areas in which actuaries have some aptitude to assist with risk management, and that focuses more around the quantitative areas. And there will be other elements of a risk management process within an organisation that sit outside of what we've got within this document. So what are the actual principles? So where we're considering the context, first, it's important to understand what are the objectives of the stakeholders that are being considered here. We need to understand what viewpoints are of most interest. That will inform the way we go about doing any modelling and the type of outputs we want to see. Under describing the system, we have gathering knowledge and data to reduce the uncertainty, and that is about collecting enough information that you can produce a piece of modelling that provides some sort of reflection of the system of interest, and is not purely based on speculation, so there is some evidence behind it. Obviously, you have to be aware that systems can change and the historic evidence might not reflect what happens in the future, but the more information you know about it, the more you can assess whether or not something is important to include. Understanding the connection between risks is perhaps an area where actuaries can bring some real value. Often risk management looks at risks in isolation, so there's one risk being considered after another. Actuaries are quite good at understanding there is connection between different things, and where you might change one thing, it'll have an impact somewhere else, and there's accumulations of risks that can occur. And within the types of modelling we typically do, we can capture some of that interaction and help people understand it. With all that information to back us, and we understand what the important objectives are and what outcomes we want to look at, then we can develop an initial model. And obviously we always have to be aware that a model is just a representation. It is not an accurate picture of what will happen. So we need to understand what the limitations are and ensure we're communicating those appropriately to stakeholders. When we're measuring the risks, we need to consider the full range of possible outcomes. It's not just a single estimate. Quite often risk management can be a case of likelihood times impact. That gives you a single figure for what the risk is, and people use that to define where they look at risks, where they try and put mitigations in place. In practice, risks with the same impact times likelihood answer can be very different. Some can have a much broader range of potential outcomes, and understanding that range of potential can assist decision makers in making accurate and appropriate decisions. Looking over the full time horizon of interest, traditionally actuaries look very long term in a lot of the modelling they do. In life insurance, in pensions, we look over many, many years into the future. And we should be aware and informing people that the risks they're subject to will change over time. So, for instance, looking at mortality, if you just look over the short term, mortality changes may have minimal impact on the profits of a company, for instance. If you consider it over a much longer time horizon, that can be a significant risk if mortality changes significantly. We need to understand about the system we're looking at and how it might change in the future. No system is static, and we shouldn't assume that if we develop a model that will be sufficient in all future scenarios. We need to be able to identify where things are changing and then adapt what we're doing to allow for those changes. And something we should all be very familiar with, stress testing and scenario testing of our models and our outputs. Again, scenario analysis particularly can be very useful for decision makers who may not understand some of the complexities of other modelling, but can understand a particular scenario and then identify where there is a particular risk. But at the same time, when looking at those sort of things, we need to be alert to personal biases. So that can be personal biases as we produce models. Do we ignore things that we think are just irrelevant because our experience is they haven't been relevant in the past, but we might be limiting ourselves? But do the decision makers only consider certain scenarios and forget about the rest and make their decisions on that basis? So it's important to be aware of what biases are there and how to explain those to other people so that they can get other input and views to allow for that. And then finally, the last three principles here around managing the risk. So firstly, developing a clear risk strategy. We need to understand what resources are available to mitigate any risks. We need to understand which risks are of most concern to us and prioritise those. And we need to understand the extent to which we're willing to accept risks in return for rewards. Once we have that understanding of what the strategy is, what we can and cannot do, we can use that with our modelling to inform what are the best ways to go around controlling and mitigating those risks. And as part of that process, understanding whether that has any consequential impacts in other areas and other risks that we have. And then finally, as I've said before, systems are not static, they're dynamic. So we have monitoring the risks, which allows us to review whether the approach we're taking remains appropriate, whether things have changed, whether there are new risks emerging that we need to be aware of, whether our mitigations are continuing to work or need to be altered. And that's a process that we will continue to review and revise and will inform future decisions that are made. So that's a very quick run through of the principles, which will be discussed in the case studies coming up. And I'm very pleased to welcome Jasveer Grewal to present our first case study. And Jasveer is a GI actuary working at Tokyo Marine Kiln. She has a master's degree in mathematical modelling and scientific computing from the University of Oxford, and has several years' experience in capital modelling. Her current role involves the parameterization of the internal model development, as well as regulatory reporting. And Jasveer has a keen interest in cyber risk and risk management, and is involved in several working parties, including the Model Risk and Cyber Risk Working Party. So I'll now hand over to Jasveer.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so now that we've been introduced to the actuarial risk principles, we're going to now go through a series of practical case studies just so we can illustrate the benefits of using such a risk management approach. So as Matt already discussed, the presentation will last for about 15 minutes, after which we'll move straight on to the next case study. Please keep any questions for the Q&A session after all three case studies, and I'll be happy to answer any questions then. Okay, so let's start. In terms of the agenda, we'll start off by considering what cyber risk captures, and more importantly, why we as an industry should start being more aware of our potential cyber risk exposure. Now, when I refer to cyber risk in this presentation, I do so from an operational risk perspective rather than with an insurance risk focus in mind. We'll then go through each of the actuarial risk principles in turn and consider how we can use such a framework and apply it practically in order to develop a strategy for controlling and managing cyber risk. And finally, we'll conclude and reflect back on using this risk management approach. So let's start the presentation by defining what we mean by cyber risk. Okay, so cyber risk refers to losses to an organisation from some sort of failure to its IT systems. The losses can range from things like, for example, financial losses to reputational damage and business interruption. And we'll go through the various types of losses at a later stage in the presentation. The main point to emphasize here is that any company that has online business activity, whether it trades online, has electronic systems, has IT networks, has cyber risk exposure. Now, you may think that I'm stating the obvious a little here, but I just want to point out the key thing is to keep in mind that whilst many organizations will acknowledge that they have some kind of cyber risk exposure, not as many perhaps appreciate to be cyber risk to be something material enough for it to be something significant on their radar. And we've got a few examples listed on the slide of where cyber risk has hit the news. So one good example would be the Anthem hack, where one of the United States' largest health insurers lost a lot of customer personal information while it was stolen from their IT systems. The information included things like names, addresses, employment information, as well as salary information. Another good example, as I'm sure you'll all be aware of, is the recent global WannaCry ransomware attack. And that had cyber risk hitting the headlines across the globe and really forced many industries to sit up and take note. Now, for me, the most interesting part about that WannaCry ransomware attack was the fact that most of the issues were around the Windows 7 operating system. Now, there was no vulnerability in that operating system, and Microsoft had actually released an operating system patch, in order to rectify the security hole. However, worryingly, many of the companies that had been affected simply did not apply the patch, or perhaps even more worryingly, a lot of the companies affected were simply using operating systems that were no longer being supported by Microsoft. And if nothing else, that illustrates how, on a spectrum of operational risks, perhaps cyber risk isn't getting the attention that it deserves. And then one final thing I want to point out on this slide is the upcoming General Data Protection Regulation. So this regulation comes into effect from the 25th of May next year, and GDPR provides EU-wide obligation that organizations provide notification in the event of a data breach. There's also various other obligations on data controllers, things like demonstrating compliance, as well as the potential for fines in terms of regulatory infringements. And if nothing else, again, it helps bring cyber risk to the attention of board members across industries. Okay, so hopefully now I've hit home the message that cyber risk is very important, and that we, regardless of the industries that we're working in, should definitely sit up and take note and appreciate that cyber risk exposure can be quite substantial. Let's now move on to discuss the reason why we're here, the actuarial risk principles. So there's a reminder of the principles on this slide, and we'll go through each of the risk principles in turn now to consider how this framework can be used to give a structured approach when trying to develop a strategy for managing cyber risk. So let's start with considering the context. Okay, so the first principle in the framework suggests that we consider the context. So we think about who our key stakeholders are, and obviously that will vary depending on whether you work for an insurance company, a pension fund, or wider fields. We also think about, what are their risk appetites? And as already discussed, cyber risk is relevant to a wide range of organisations, and it's important to clarify the stakeholders' degree of concern relating to cyber risk. So we've already discussed how you need to keep in mind that a stakeholder's perception of cyber risk may not be close to the actual cyber risk exposure. And just think back to that Windows 7 operating system, that patch. I wonder at the time whether many boards were thinking of that to be something important enough to be brought to their attention. And then finally, it's also important to take into consideration the various ways in which cyber risk can manifest. And there's some examples listed on the slide here. So cyber risk can be in the form of direct costs. So it could be things like extortion costs. Whether ransom demand should be paid or not is probably for another discussion. Other direct costs could be things like the cost to repair a system, PR management, notification costs, as well as regulatory defence. Now, we've already touched upon EU GDPR, but just to give you a little bit of more information, so that regulation will have a tiered approach in terms of potential penalties. So just to give you an idea about the level of fines, fines can be up to the higher of 4% of annual worldwide turnover for an organisation, the higher of that amount, and 20 million euros, just to illustrate how the direct costs can be substantial. Then there's also indirect costs, the costs of setting up a computer forensics investigation, as well as business interruption. And the recent example that comes to mind is the system failure that caused BA to cancel thousands of flights. I think it was 3 weeks ago now. And yeah, that system failure was actually caused by a power surge. And it's estimated that the compensation bill can be as much as £150 million, which is clearly an eye-watering amount. But the key thing that I found interesting from that case was the fact that normally, typically, internal infrastructure failures would be covered under a standard cyber insurance policy, but BA didn't have any cyber cover. And so, although that, as with any insurance policy, you always need to keep in mind potential exclusions. And for cyber policy, sometimes typically there are exclusions for external infrastructure failures. But I just wanted to illustrate that example just to show how business interruption costs can be substantial. And then finally, there's also opportunity costs, so where we can have reduced customer trust as well as reputational damage. Okay, so now that we've considered the context and we've thought about who our key stakeholders are, their risk appetites, and also what concerns that they have the biggest concerns about, which risks, we're now ready to lay the foundation upon which we can further analyse the risk by describing the system. Okay, so the first step for the risk manager would be to gather information. Now, it's unlikely that the actuary in question will be the biggest expert in cyber risk, so it's vital that they work with internal and external teams in order to build an accurate picture of a firm's cyber risk exposure. For me, the most exciting thing about cyber risk is the fact that it's an area where the risk is evolving so rapidly, and if anything, that further emphasises the need for an actuary to work with external experts, as well as keeping an eye out for external sources of information, such as those news reports. Gathering information will also enable the actuary to identify weak spots and see the potential for risk accumulations. Just think back to that slide where we saw the geographical reach of that global WannaCry ransomware attack. And then again, also in my personal opinion, in particular, it's this quantification and appreciation for this potential accumulation of risk that is lacking across our industry. And then finally, once we've identified key factors and their interactions, we can move towards developing an initial model. And the factors could be things like the company profile and so on. So, for example, you might think that certain companies are more likely to be attacked by hackers. For example, they might have a bad reputation, such as banks, or they may hold valuable data, such as the Anthem hack that we saw earlier. And there are obstacles when trying to build an initial model, especially with a risk like cyber, and we'll discuss that on the next slide. Okay, so over the last couple of slides, we've considered the context, we've thought about who our key stakeholders are, we've considered their risk appetites, and we've also looked at the potential costs. We've also described the system by gathering information and identifying key factors and any potential weak spots. We're now ready to move on to the next actuarial risk principle, where we're measuring the risk. Now, the key difficulties when thinking about cyber risk, the key difficulties are things like there's a lack of historical data, and also the rate at which the risk is evolving. And furthermore, there's multiple sources of potential cyber risk losses. And I've listed a few examples at the bottom of the slide here, just to explain some of the terms and demystify the jargon a bit. So for some of the terms that may not be so obvious, a denial of service attack refers to an attack where basically an attacker is just trying to disrupt online business activity by essentially just bombarding a website with a big amount of traffic. We've also got password attacks, or man in the middle, where essentially communication between two systems is intercepted by an outside entity. And then finally, we've got a zero-day attack, where hackers exploit a security hole in a soft piece of software that the vendor is unaware about. Okay, so since there's many different sources of cyber risk, and also there's other difficulties such as there being a lack of historical data, it makes it even more important that we make any assumptions made in any model as explicit as possible. And this is not only so we conduct the stress and sensitivity testing that Matt was discussing earlier, but also so that any assumptions can be updated in light of recent experience. A good example that comes to mind is I would have loved to have seen how estimated return periods for a global ransomware attack change pre and post the WannaCry attack. And then finally, for cyber risk, it's fundamental that a full range of scenarios be considered. So in particular, an effective cyber risk model will not only focus on just the highly likely scenarios, but also look at the extreme tail scenarios as well. So that is what I mean is we won't just be focusing on one corner of the spectrum as illustrated by the diagram. Now, there are difficulties in identifying potential outcomes and where they fall on the frequency severity matrix, especially when you're considering cyber risk. But this is an area that the Cyber Risk Working Party is currently working on, where we're studying a few examples of cyber scenarios and potential effects. So hopefully you'll see some results very soon on that. Okay, so now that we've built a picture about an organization's potential cyber risk exposure and we've come up with plausible scenarios, we're now ready to gather that information to come up with a course of action so that we can control and manage cyber risk. As with any risk, we consider the risk appetite when trying to develop a risk strategy and coming up with planning any potential mitigating actions. I've listed a few examples on the slide there. Other ones could be things like developing business continuity plans and so on. The key thing with cyber risk is that the risk must be monitored. Regular horizon scanning for cyber risk is vital. It's not something that should be done on just an annual basis. And that brings us nicely back to the first actuarial risk principle. As Matt mentioned, this framework is not supposed to be just a box ticking exercise, it is a continuous cycle. And that is especially the case for cyber risk. Okay, so to summarize, we've discussed the importance of cyber risk and the growing importance for organizations to become more aware of their cyber risk exposure. We've also looked at various real-life examples and the potential scale of cyber risk losses. And hopefully that's illustrated the point for organizations to sit up, acknowledge, and manage their cyber risk. And then finally, we've also considered the difficulties when trying to measure cyber risk. And some of the actuarial risk principles are particularly relevant here. Things like gathering expert knowledge, considering the interconnectivity between risks, as well as scenario analysis. And that makes the framework even more useful when considering the ever-developing landscape of cyber risk and data protection. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jasmine. That's really interesting there. I'd now like to hand over to Kevin Wenzel, who's Chief Actuary for Allianz in the UK. Kevin started his career at Eagle Star as an actuarial trainee in the Life and Pensions Department, moving to Allianz in 1999 to perform a range of actuarial roles. Kevin's responsible for the actuarial advice to Allianz UK relating to reserving, strategic planning and input to capital setting, and he also leads the finance business partnering team. Kevin's an active member of the IFOA and is chairman of the AGF Pension Trustees, which has around 2,000 members. And he's going to talk a slightly different area for us today around autonomous vehicles.
That's great, thank you, Matt. So just to be clear on this, I've not been involved in the creation of these principles, so I take no credit for them. But I say that because I found it very interesting when I was asked to come and have a look at this, because I was interested about applying the risk principles to something. So what I'm going to do is walk you through an exercise which we undertook to apply it to a particular area of interest, which is around autonomous vehicles. So let's have a look through and see how it's working. So just to remind you, I think you've seen this slide and no doubt we'll see it again throughout the presentations, but we're talking about a set of principles where we're going to start with the context, as was just done a moment ago. We're going to try to describe the system, talk about measuring the risk, and then we'll talk a little bit about managing the risk, which perhaps for the autonomous vehicles is a slightly more difficult area. And as was mentioned before, this is a continuous circuit because autonomous vehicles are themselves advancing very rapidly, surprisingly so when you look into it. And so I think being on top of this cycle and continually going round is a very important feature. So let's give it a go. What have I done? Turned it off. So the risk context. Now, one of the things that I say when I came to this to look at applying it to something, I think when you think of autonomous vehicles, my head goes off in all sorts of different places when I talk about the risk. there's lots of risks which relate quite easily into the sort of everyday, how does this work in practice, and maybe the sort of thing that bleeds into the pricing areas that we think about. And then there's the tail risk events, which we can also think of, which are a very different type of aspect, and maybe that's into the capital and reinsurance type space. There's an awful lot of different stakeholders you can potentially think about. So what we've tried to do is use the risk principles here and focus in on a number of stakeholders to say, what is it that they are perhaps thinking of with that insurance point in mind? So here's some examples. The government. So what we're saying here is, we need an insurance system that helps the autonomous vehicle revolution to drive economic growth. So the government's all about talking around autonomous vehicles and how they may help the economy, how they can be a positive thing for society. And they want insurance, as it's always been, to be something which underpins that and helps the autonomous vehicle revolution, as we say here, to progress. So that's an interesting context. What about our drivers? Well, not surprisingly, they want their cover and they want it to be affordable. But particularly they want no gaps, and we'll come back to that a little bit later, because someone who's driving a vehicle around, they want to know that they're covered and that they're insured in the way that they are today. They don't want to have problems with their insurance because it's now an autonomous vehicle as opposed to one that they might otherwise drive. Owners of larger fleets perhaps have a slightly different perspective. They want to think about maybe the way that the insurance works when you're talking about big fleets of vehicles, and maybe we'll get on to talking about some of the ownership characteristics. But maybe a new one for us now in this vehicle space, which we don't consider at the moment necessarily, are the software providers. Because of course autonomous vehicles have software power in them to make them drive around in that autonomous manner. So we suddenly have this software provider stakeholder that perhaps we've not had before. And car manufacturers, well, the reason we include them here on the insurance aspect is perhaps it's the vehicle itself which has its own proprietary software and its own ways that they are developing these autonomous vehicles to work that brings the actual vehicle car manufacturer into play as well, and they have a particular interest. So really we've got a range of stakeholders here to consider, and the framework we're using is just starting to help us identify those and think about them. So which parties should we listen to? Can we listen to all of them? Can we actually cope with each of their requirements? So as I've said, lots of different stakeholders here. There's a few others mentioned there as well, the general public in particular. And we say here quite provocatively perhaps, is it impossible to keep everyone happy? Should we try to do so? Well, we have to think clearly about what each of their goals are and what role that the insurance company is trying to play. So we're going to look at the insurance aspect, as I say, and try to think about the risks that we run as insurance companies in this space, and perhaps ways that we at least understand, manage, and if possible, minimise those risks. So what are some key questions? We put a couple up here for us. The transition point is an interesting one because we don't suddenly find overnight all the vehicles are autonomous. There are some good models in place which talk about 5 stages of autonomy, from nothing at all through to fully, you get in a vehicle, it may not even have a steering wheel and off it drives to where you wish to go. But in between there are lots of stages which we could call transition stages. And if you think about on top of that then, all of the vehicles on the road at any point in time, we're going to have a mix of autonomous, semi-autonomous and manual, if I can call them that. So how are we going to handle that when we think about this particular aspects of risk? What we told our policyholders might be another interesting point. And in particular, when we start thinking about the risk aspects, have we explored the product liability insurance model? So we'll come in a moment to think about, if there's an accident, who it is that's liable. So let's talk about describing the system, the next point of the process. Well, the thing we're interested in primarily for motor insurance, in the traditional sense, is around collisions. So how are we going to understand what the collision risk changes when we talk about autonomous vehicles? There's lots of talk about accident frequency going down, but how do we measure that? And we'll come to look at that in a moment. But really we need to think about the key factors for the system and how they all interact. And this starts to bring in different factors from traditional driving and insurance because of that autonomous nature and the software which sits behind it. How claims are processed is an interesting point. So this is something which has come to the fore with some recent consultations in the UK. But essentially, there are a number of different models, and we describe 2 potential ones here. The one which the UK seems to be moving towards is the first, which is around a single insurance model. So the idea there is that the accident occurs, And in the same way as traditional insurance works, the insurer deals with the claim regardless of whether it was autonomous, semi-autonomous, or just an ordinary driver, in both vehicles as may be the case. And then behind the scenes, the insurer will then sort out if there's any liability to attribute, say, to the manufacturer or to the software house that provided the software. Now that's good for the drivers, that's good perhaps for the general public because there's not a whole host of complexity in there they need to deal with. But as we say with the risks for insurers, where does that leave the insurer in terms of if there is a third party, say the software house or the manufacturer, which needs to be pursued to make a recovery? Because from it being the case at the moment where an accident has happened and you can dispute liability on a case-by-case basis, if software is to blame or the vehicle manufacturer, you might find that suddenly you've got a much more precedent-setting situation where if that software were to blame in this instance, does it mean that there's a problem which goes across the whole fleet of cars, which may give a far higher liability to the manufacturer? That may cause much more adversarial situations than may otherwise exist. Now, the opposite to that, of course, is that we could have the insurance split out into the two components. So our traditional when the driver drives insurance is still provided by insurers, but a different product liability insurance is provided to cover the autonomous activities of the vehicle. But again, that leads to difficulties around how we price the insurance for those two pieces. So neither model is particularly right or wrong, but they each produce different outcomes. We need to be aware of what the legal framework is moving towards in the countries in which we're operating. However, what we're trying to do, as is traditional, is build a model of frequency and the cost of claims involved in these autonomous vehicles. So, let's think about some of the outcomes. And now we've talked a little bit about, if you like, the day-to-day risk activities which we'd think about in pricing traditionally. What about some of those large tail losses? Now, we obviously have the normal big severe incidents where someone's very severely injured, but we actually now have new things introduced as tail risk potentially. And some examples that we've thought about within this risk framework are around extreme weather. What we mean by that is how good are these pieces of software at monitoring distances, situations, etc., if there are very extreme weather conditions in place? And could that therefore affect a large number of autonomous vehicles in a particular area because of that accumulation where the weather event is taking place? What if there are a software malfunction? That might suddenly go across an entire fleet or a particular aspect of use of the vehicle. Or, dare we say, what if there were hacking? Would somebody hack into the software of these vehicles and try to do something malicious? Now, we presume that these are all relatively low frequency, but of course, were they to happen, they could be quite severe in their impact, and that's something that we need to think about. We talked about the transition process, so I'm always surprised at how quickly this is progressing, but nonetheless, it is progressing at a pace, and the vehicles being tested on the roads at the moment will soon start to come into production. There is already semi-autonomous and a number of vehicles capable of a certain amount of autonomous driving being tested. But over time, we'll have more of these introduced, and in many ways, it may be the legislative framework and the insurance aspects which are struggling to keep up with these technological advances. So we need to consider how that changes in the immediate time period, but also as we look further ahead over different time horizons, which we'll come back to again with this whole looping round to consider our risk framework. Which are external factors which might change as well. Now, the reason that we mention here around electric vehicles, one aspect of the autonomous vehicles is if they are likely to have fewer accidents, potentially they can be far lighter vehicles with less protection built in, which means therefore that things like electric vehicles and the weight of batteries, etc., become much more economical. So there's a connection there perhaps between autonomous vehicle technology and the increased use of electric vehicles, which might be linked again to the oil prices mentioned here. So there's lots of different drivers going on which might influence the advancement of these vehicles. So we talked a moment ago about using stress and scenario testing, and that's a particularly good one here to think about the tail risks and explore some of those aspects. I suspect, however, they'll be very hard to parameterize and a very wide range of what you might assume as reasonable assumptions. We also can consider the pathways, as we talked before, between how the current vehicle fleet changes into a more autonomous vehicle fleet and the steps in between. And then maybe even the change in vehicle ownership, because often with these autonomous vehicles, I've seen examples spoken about before at various places where if the vehicle can drive itself, well, suddenly that creates a whole new use of your vehicle. You may choose to own a vehicle, but perhaps when you're not using it, like you're sat here today, why can't your car be out ferrying people around and making you some money? What about in terms of someone's talked before around needing to charge these vehicles and putting charging points everywhere? Well, if they can charge themselves, sorry, if they can drive themselves, why shouldn't the vehicle go off overnight to maybe an empty car park of a supermarket, which has lots of charging points, and it charges itself up and comes and picks you up in the morning? There's lots of different changes that come about once you get to autonomy. So this whole vehicle ownership and structure itself could change as well. When we talk about the sharing economy, maybe this is another feature which will play into that. Another stress test we've mentioned here at the bottom, what if all the cars go offline at the same time? Maybe that's related back to the hacking point or a software problem. But what would happen if suddenly all these vehicles are driving around and they all failed at the same time in terms of their software? You know, there's lots of scenarios you could play out there which are at this extreme tail event. How do we manage the risk? Well, this perhaps is a difficult one. We can certainly think about our risk appetite and the ways that we think about retaining or mitigating those risks, perhaps through using things like reinsurance to pass it on to others, but it still therefore stays within the insurance space. But do you even think about saying, well, perhaps we'll only insure vehicles which are not autonomous? How viable is that really? And then you have the problems, of course, that if your vehicle is not autonomous, it may still have an accident with one that is, and you have to still get involved in some of these disputes. So the risk management aspects need some thought, and strategies therefore need to be thought through, but we need to be realistic about what we can actually do in practice. But the last question, I think, is a really important one, because we should be prepared to answer this. When we have the stakeholders or we have the shareholders of our companies, how will your business be affected by the transition to autonomous vehicles? And we should have a plan to think about how we deal with that. So, clearly, monitoring what's happening in the market is an important point. We're thinking about the models and the parameters which we're using. We can think about the autonomous vehicles' numbers and how they're growing. That's information that should be available. We can understand the technology and the advances being made. I mentioned the legal and regulatory position. I suspect that that will, somehow not keep the pace that the autonomous vehicles and the manufacturers themselves are pushing at. So that's something which we need to consider. And these all become effectively emerging risks to us. And we need to incorporate those into the models as we get better understanding. And finally, as I've said earlier, does this mean therefore that the perspectives of our stakeholders change? So these were the ones we mentioned before. And of course, we've still got the same points noted here. But as I said, on the drivers, do they want any gaps in cover? Of course not. And we need to think therefore around how that's provided. But most of all, we just need to consider who it is we're listening to. And I came back to my earlier point, can we meet all of those demands and balance the needs of all of those people? Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And now we're going to finish off in a nice circular way with Nico, who started off the whole process. Nico's the chair of the Resource and Environment Board of the profession and previously chaired its research subcommittee. The Research and Environment Board works collaboratively with actuaries, financial institutions and regulators to ensure their analysis and advice includes sustainability issues. I'm sure you've all seen the risk alert around climate change that went out recently, which Nico was heavily involved with. And he's co-authored the IFOA's policy briefing on managing the risk and uncertainty around climate change. He qualified in 2009 and works as an independent consultant in the investment management and pensions industry, focusing on DC benefits. And today he's going to talk to us about climate change.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance. Really good to see so many of you here to see the risk principles being launched. Now I'm going to talk to you about climate change. Climate change, I think, is maybe slightly unusual in the sort of comparing it to cyber risk and autonomous vehicles, because it is this kind of big, uncertain thing deeply into the future that a lot of us might sit down and at first pass think, wow, it's kind of too difficult for us to manage. So really, I think the risk principles set out a process that we can start to grapple with some of these issues. Maybe again, slightly in contrast, I don't think we can come out with a definitive answer, but this is a process that we can follow. And I hope that as we kind of go around this cycle a few times, we'll start to get closer and closer to, let's say, consensus as to how to deal with this issue. I think it's always worth just starting off any conversation about climate change, just maybe setting out kind of the state of the science. It's great talking in the UK because generally I think there's a sort of popular understanding that climate change is real, and I don't have to necessarily battle climate skepticism, but it is worth just kind of talking out the points from the Paris Accord, which was the UN process culminating in November 2015, with basically global governments agreeing to manage climate change. So the UN has a body called the IPCC, that's the International Panel on Climate Change. They produce assessment reports. The fifth assessment report, which came out about 4 or 5 years ago, basically, in my view, has this kind of smoking gun. It says, over the last 100, 150 years, the emissions of greenhouse gases have clearly gone up. And that is the result of human activity. If you model the changes of the warming of the climate, and you know, we stand here in London on a hot day and maybe regret the warming of the climate. I don't know. I'm quite sanguine about it. And if you model the warming of the climate, particularly over the last 50 or so years, there is a clear explanatory factor coming from greenhouse gases. Projecting into the future, if we follow a sort of business as usual path of greenhouse gas emissions, then the climate science says we're on course for somewhere between a 3-degree and 6 or even 8-degree amount of warming relative to pre-industrial temperatures. So that's really before we discovered how useful coal was to burn. And in those kinds of scenarios, really we're starting to talk about extinction of many species groups on Earth, including humans. And then finally, the sort of policy outcome is that we need to get to a net zero emissions economy. So for every bit of greenhouse gases that are emitted, someone is absorbing it by roughly 2035. So there are various different kind of calculations on there. Obviously, it's about the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere rather than the rate that we emit them. But at some stage, we need that stock to stop growing, and therefore we need to not be emitting them. So there is this kind of policy environment which says if we do that, if we get to this kind of net zero economy by roughly 2035, then we only have warming of something like 2 degrees versus pre-industrial levels. 2 degrees is this kind of magic number because there are thought to be all sorts of tipping points that will occur if we kind of go past that amount. So if you look at the ice across the top of the planet here, when it's in Siberia, it actually covers some methane. If you let that ice melt, then methane, which is a much worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, could well be emitted in huge amounts. And then instead of us being in control of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases and global warming, actually the planet kind of takes control, and we've just unleashed the climate beast, as some commentators call it. So the results of the UN process and the Paris Accord is to say that there is a global policy initiative now shared by pretty much all of the governments, and we might come back to that in questions, all the governments around the world to say, actually, we wish to limit global warming to 2 degrees because beyond that it's really dangerous. And to do that, we need to effectively transition our economy from this high carbon, high intensity of greenhouse gas production through to a low carbon or no carbon economy. So rather than talking about the kind of long-term changes of sea level and changes in effects of extreme weather, as the sort of primary risk that we should be discussing, I want to tie much more back to the kind of policy risk of what institutional investors, actuarial clients are going to be doing in the face of that kind of transition. And those of you who are actuaries, Matt mentioned the risk alert. Hopefully you did see that. If you didn't, check your junk mail. You never quite know what your email provider does with emails from the IFOA. But check and see that you've got that. Essentially, it says that climate change is a material risk, which should be the subject of actuarial conversations with clients. Absent certain conditions which it is up for you to decide. So if you've got a client who's really got a kind of 1-year horizon, then it may be within your discretion to say, well, we don't need to mention climate change. If we're talking about 50-year liabilities, then for sure climate change is going to kind of happen on that watch, so it needs to be into your advice. Okay, so I'll just go through sort of similar process to discuss the kind of context. So in the center here, we have a corporation, so a business. It could easily be talking about a pension scheme or an insurer. And we have a government who says that we need to get to a net zero economy, so an economy which isn't emitting greenhouse gases by a certain date. At the same time, we have a tension with investors who say, well, I would like you to make a return. I need you to produce a return over the next X years. That didn't install is that the WannaCry protection? There we go. Always install your updates. You have clients and consumers who want to trust the brands that they're buying in. And, you know, at a certain point in the past, that didn't include things. You know, if you think about sweatshops and different pieces of reputational risk, over time, I think you can see civil society becoming much more interested in the kind of embedded carbon dioxide emissions of products. So you need to think about what your consumers are worried about for your products. You have suppliers who supply you, and maybe there's embedded carbon dioxide in what they sell you. Maybe they themselves are supplied and they kind of wave their hands. There's a supply chain that you need to be kind of grappling with to understand the carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions coming from that. At the same time, you have employees who are saying, we basically wish to work for companies that align with our values. What are their values? Maybe you should go and discuss that or share your principles and values with them. So again, you get to this kind of stakeholder mapping where you need to kind of understand all of these different views and come to some form of consensus as to what the purpose of the corporation, the purpose of that pension scheme is in relation to these kind of climate risks. And there are tensions. So on the one hand, you know, you've potentially got, you know, an investor who's saying, well, you made this great return when you were digging out energy into the ground basically for free. What's it going to be like if it's more expensive for you to have energy? I want a return, please. Thank you very much. And I may well allocate my capital on that basis. And at the same time, you might have consumers or employees who are saying, I couldn't possibly work for a company that's destroying my children's future. How do you reconcile those tensions? The first step is obviously to kind of talk through that process. One of the things I think that is quite important to come from the risk principles, and this comes maybe even from a piece of work before that, looking at extreme risks, is to ask what kind of level of impact can your organization survive? So this is a, you know, sort of a generic schematic of risk. And it points out something that I think all actuaries know deep down in their bones, which is that A, there's a range of outcomes that really comes out of the risk principles work, and that B, actually, it's the really unlikely outcomes that can scupper you. So there are these risks where you have a threshold, and beyond which really your survival is questioned. As a corporation with limited liability, taking risk is a part of your essence. It's very difficult to get a return without taking risk. But very few corporations sit there and say, well, how often am I expected to go bust, right? Very few corporations sit there and say, If this event comes, should I in some way be trying to mitigate it and survive it, or should I just accept that that's the kind of end of my business? It's sort of okay for shareholder capitalism to kind of operate that way. The pension schemes of those corporations, I think, have quite a different view. So the pension scheme of a fossil fuel company who sat there saying, well, you know, we'll either go out of business in 2020 or 2030, you know, hey-ho. The pension scheme, the liabilities are going to last a lot longer. So one of the things that we're quite interested in is getting pension schemes to talk about the covenant risk in terms of climate change. So fossil fuel company's pension scheme will probably exist longer than the fossil fuel company unless that fossil fuel company is starting to understand the renewable energy transition, which is coming. So asking that kind of question, going to your stakeholders and saying, well, you know, if you are an investor, how many companies in your portfolio do you kind of accept is the risk of doing business to go bankrupt in a year? If you are that employee, if you are that pension scheme, then maybe the views are quite different. So I think probably obvious, we can't keep everyone happy. The most important thing is to state your position and be clear around what your ambition is. And then you're allowing others to kind of walk away if that's what it is. And by the way, walk towards you if you are the kind of company who's saying attractive things for the new generation of consumers. And just a sort of generic question, what has the corporation told or engaged with stakeholders about climate change? And what do they say? Right? So if you don't know the answers to those questions as a corporate, kind of now is the time to start finding that out. One of the things that maybe the switched on consumers, the switched on investors will be asking you is, when will you be prepared to be part of the net zero economy? Is it like tomorrow because everything is now renewable in your business? Is it never because your business is entirely based on fossil fuels and we don't want to change, thank you very much? Most likely somewhere in between. So having an understanding of that net zero economy and what that looks like for you is going to be a critical engagement point with stakeholders in the future. So having promised not to talk about some of the effects of climate change, I will now talk about some of the effects of climate change. This is coming from Mark Carney's speech at Mansion House in about September 2015 in preparation for the Paris discussions. Mark Carney described 3 categories of risk, and it's quite a useful kind of risk taxonomy to discuss. So we discussed physical risks, liability risks, and transition risks in relation to not only kind of, let's say, real climate change, what happens to the weather and your physical world as a result of a warming planet, but also that kind of policy environment. So first off, physical risk. This is basically damage caused to you by climate change, kind of above the kind of damage of weather that you would normally expect. So that could be sea level rises. Interestingly, sea level rises, I'm always surprised, but it's actually slightly slower than one might think. So London is not going to be flooded tomorrow. It's actually touching wood. In London, we actually have a plan to extend the Thames barrier, I think, in about 2050, 2060. So London is pretty confident that it's going to survive sea level rises through to about 2120, at which point a third plan comes in. But more damaging, probably in the short term, is things like storm surge, which is that if you have a bigger storm because there's more energy in the system, you can have more damage coming from the kind of hurricane in the North Sea, which causes much greater flooding than just that kind of average level of sea level rises. As a part of that windstorm, you can, of course, have extreme precipitation, so massive flooding that we've seen in the northeast of England at various points in the last few years, and, of course, wind damage stemming from that. And the flip side is actually the rain can be falling a lot over there and not at all over here, so drought may well become more prevalent in future. So if you own agricultural assets, if you are an agricultural business and your entire business is dependent on the rain, then starting to understand how rainfall patterns might change, starting to think about how you might mitigate water shortages in future is going to be really important. So we've got some time to plan for the physical effects. So can you move those assets? Could you take that farm out of a country where drought might become more prevalent and put it into a different part of that country or a different country entirely? Can you build higher walls around your assets if they're on the sea? Can you move them back up the hill path and into the mainland? So you can start to look at the physical assets that a corporation or insurance company or pension schemes own and start to say, well, you know, we can plan for this. The second one, and I think for my eyes, almost the most important one, is liability risks. So to me, this comes down to two things. The sort of Mark Carney version here is, so Tuvalu, it's a Pacific island, quite an important block in the Paris Accord discussions, where these nations really threatened, existentially threatened by climate change. Tuvalu, there's a reasonable chance in the next, what is it, it's about 50 years, that the sea level will just inundate, and Tuvalu has nothing currently above 3 meters, I think, above sea level. So once you're at about 2 meters above sea level, a storm surge can just flood your entire nation. Who do the people of Tuvalu go to get compensation for their lost home? Do they go to BP, Shell, Exxon? Well, maybe, but there's quite a few of these nations. And actually, the cost of that sort of level of damage may well exceed the liability, the balance sheet of those kind of fossil fuel companies. So do they then go storming through that limited liability piece and coming on to the ultimate owner? Potentially. Potentially a policy environment could exist which that changes. But I think the better framing of liability risk, particularly for actuaries, is a sort of investment risk. So here we are, we're actuaries, we've been sat in boardrooms for the last 20 years, not including climate change in our advice. Tomorrow, some event happens which damages the portfolio by 10, 15, 20% of loss. Client comes back to us and says, well, come on guys, you've got a VAR model, you were telling me about the likely range of outcomes, this has clearly exceeded it, why wasn't that in your advice? So professional liability piece. This is really the stimulus for the risk alert. We wish actuaries to start thinking through that kind of process and saying, well, actually, maybe we do need to have a strategic piece of advice around climate change so that can trickle through into the portfolio management process and start to mitigate some of that risk. That feels entirely selfish for me to say to you, you should protect yourselves, but hey, let's do good by doing good to ourselves. The great thing about liability risks is that to some extent, they're relatively easy to calculate. These liabilities, whether it's the Tuvalu case or the exposure to climate damage, are going to be coming from the emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So you can go right now and ask every single business that you invest in how much they emit. Now, there may well be some double counting, and it might be quite difficult to kind of remove all of that double counting, but you can certainly understand on a sector basis whether you're invested in the ones in the sector who are emitting the most or the least. And you can start to say, well, that amount of emissions is a liability that I cannot bear. You can start to do the work to understand this risk. How much you reserve for this risk, how much you expect to hold back to pay off some of these liabilities, I think is a very difficult question. But from a mitigation perspective, you can start to engage and put a plan in place to get to this kind of net zero economy and indeed against a certain time frame. So the liability risk piece, I think for us as actuaries or for anyone in the sort of financial services world is a really important piece to grapple with because it is our careers. So the final piece on Mark Carney's kind of list is transition risks. I'd frame it thus. We had an old economy which was very much based on fossil fuels and emitting greenhouse gases. We know there's a new economy which has zero greenhouse gas emissions. Which do you buy, right? The quicker you buy the new economy and buy and build the new economy and disinvest and move away from the old economy, the less you are exposed to unexpected speed changes between that movement. If you're an institutional investor, your decision-making speed is much slower than a high-frequency trader, right? A high-frequency trader can read the newswire electronically overnight on a Sunday and have pretty much put all of the trades in place, which have devalued the portfolio that you held in the old economy and bid up beyond your wildest dreams the new economy portfolio, and you have just missed out, right? There's a massive market discontinuity you cannot time. If you as a pension scheme or an insurer can sit there and say, well, we kind of know this is going to happen, so the sooner we start to deal with it, the better, you can get ahead of this curve. And indeed, you can be owning the assets that others wish to buy later down the line, and you could see their values being bid up as a result. This is a belief point. This is something that I think institutional investors in particular will have to grapple with. We've been told that markets are efficient. We're doing some work to look at efficiency in markets and say, well, you seem to have missed this one, guys, because there's a lot of unburnable carbon on the markets which you own in your portfolios right now. So start to do that belief work, thinking about whether you can say a passive investor is an efficient investor. Start to do that assessment work to say, well, what are these risks? And challenge yourselves whether you think you can move quickly enough to actually get ahead of the curve, given that the trigger is going to be happening somewhere between 0 and 0.1 seconds after some news lands. So that's the transition risk. And I think each of those frames is a kind of useful touch point to discuss risk as a corporation, to discuss it as an institutional investor. They're quite useful points to just categorize some of that huge nebulous uncertainty in climate risk and try and bring it home. So these steps, I think, are slightly harder. The first chart I've taken, this is from the fourth assessment, in fact, fourth assessment report. This is really just trying to demonstrate how much uncertainty there is in climate science. This is trying to get to a parameter called equilibrium climate sensitivity, which is essentially saying, I take pre-industrial levels of greenhouse gases, I double it, what's the warming? The answer is, we really don't know. Each of these different wiggly lines is a different way of coming to that answer. So you can take ice cores, you can look at tree rings, you can look at various oceanic temperature rises, and you can try and say, well, at different points in the geological or more recent past, there were different levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What was the temperature? These all say that there is quite a wide range of potential parameters for that way of thinking about the problem. And to an extent, that's a model issue. You know, there will be a different temperature rise from a certain amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today. If you kept that stable for a long time, you'd actually see some of these feedback loops from the planet raising the temperature or lowering the temperature, so that it's still a dynamic system which will change over time. But as an actuary, we should look at this and say, we're desperately uncertain. That 2-degree scenario is effectively a 50-50 coin toss probability of surviving. Actually, we as actuaries should be looking at a much more risk-averse 1 in 200 potentially as an insurance company type level, which means that policy environment, which says we have to have carbon dioxide reduced, greenhouse gases reduced by a certain time frame, is probably quite optimistic. We should be prepared for a much heavier ramping up of that policy environment. Lots of uncertainty in climate risk. This is a tool which was launched by the North American actuaries earlier this year, recently, called the Actuaries Climate Index. This looks at extreme weather measured as high temperatures, low temperatures, extreme precipitation, drought, high winds, and sea level, and says, what is the deviation from a baseline period of the 60s, 70s, 80s? As you can see, the red bars are where there has been more extreme weather. Really, since the 90s, we've had a lot more extreme weather than we would expect if the weather was kind of, let's say, natural. this is the kind of thing that we can start potentially to see insurance companies reserving with. Where are you on the ACI? We could start to see financial investors building derivatives against this type of piece to mitigate some of these extreme risks. So there is progress in trying to kind of measure and provide tools for risk management on climate risk. Okay. So managing the risk, I think what you need to be doing is to understand what your country, our country, has promised at the Paris Agreement to deliver, and to make sure that your corporation is at or ahead of that plan. Now, as I said before, I think that plan is going to get harder, so that the transition is going to get faster. So you need to be understanding what that plan is and making sure that you're on the right side of it. You also need to be understanding within your portfolio what exposure you have to physical risks. So there's higher windstorms, potentially storm surge, drought, and start to manage and mitigate those risks. And then finally, you need to be ready to answer that question from your stakeholders, which says, what is the impact on your business from climate change? And what is your plan to manage that impact? If I ask that question to you guys in the room today, I suspect most of you, if not all of you, would not be able to answer that. Relatively soon, you're going to have to. You're going to have to, because pension schemes are going to start asking corporations, the government is going to start asking institutional investors. This is a really live debate, and it's coming. Okay. So in conclusion, Matt, it'll be very, I'm sure I've massively run over. So don't ignore climate risk. It's not something that you can pretend doesn't exist because it's too complicated, right? If you ignore it, it's still going to happen to you. Best to actually try and work out what it means and what you need to do to protect your business or your pool of assets. Again, this is a really dynamic system. It's dynamic for 2 or 3 different drivers. Climate science completely updates every so often as we understand more and more about the feedback loops in the economy. The temperature itself changes and drives that system, and the policymakers, who probably ultimately in the short term are the ones driving the risk for you, will change on the basis of those views. So this will continue to evolve probably more rapidly than we imagine, and in my view, it's only going to go in one direction. So the acceleration of government pressure is coming. And then finally, do engage with your stakeholders about what their needs from you are, and make sure that you're continuing to satisfy them. You need to remain relevant in this climate debate, in all of these innovation areas we've been talking about, and that has to come from understanding the priorities and needs of that stakeholder environment around you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nico. Yeah, you did run slightly over. We do still have some time for questions, so first one over here.
Okay, so I guess my world overlaps with Nico's most of all, but I think this develop your narrative is a really key point. Today my remarks are going to be a bit of mine. Define your ambition. Part of my ambition is helping accelerate behaviour change. I already have one colleague who is looking forward to the first actuary in front of the disciplinary panel because they didn't do what Nico was suggesting. Being slightly more helpful, I encourage anybody who's interested in sort of finance and investment to read All Swans Are Black in the Dark, which I think covers most of the 12 principles. It's part of a Tragedy of the Horizon project sponsored by the Generation Foundation and 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. And basically it shows how financial markets, it sort of tells you what you already knew, that really we don't look at risks beyond sort of 3 to 5 years much. Hence, all swans are black in the dark. Heading back to the assertive, I've already been approached by one pension fund who are putting out their scheme actuary services for tender. I have some very good questions for RFPs and for clients to ask tendering actuaries at interview. So let's accelerate some of this stuff through the system, because clients will ask about the practical, risk alert, practical guide. Sadly, at the session I was at Celtic Manor, only one person had actually read the practical guide at that time. So if you're retendering, make sure you've read it. There will be questions. And if you really want to stretch your thinking, as I am doing currently, there is a great book called Adaptive Markets by Andrew Lowe, who will be known to some of you, which really develops the sort of efficient market stuff and reminds us that economics and thus finance basically comes from biology, not physics. You know, we all know Black and Scholes is a physics diffusion equation. Actually, financial markets are more driven by biology and psychology. So those are my remarks to try and accelerate this through the profession.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple over here. Do you want to maybe work it along the line?
Thank you. These principles do make sense. My problem is that I don't see anything really actuarial about them, and I'm worried about branding them as actuarial. For over 20 years, we've had organisations like GARP and Premier. More recently, we've had SDP, and their members could have come up with a lot of that. I can't see very much in them, apart perhaps from Principles 5 and 6, which are, in any sense, distinctively actuarial. What is it we are saying we can do that other people cannot do, apart from charging a reassuringly high price for our services? Surely we should be saying, yeah, people have been doing a lot of this stuff for a long time. We can do a bit more. For example, the idea of path dependence. Nobody talks about this outside academic circles, and even then not so much. And that is something upon which we could major. Another thing that we should be thinking about is, and now I've lost it, is the idea of looking through and presenting results as distributions rather than numbers. We're not doing that, and we really should. So I think we have a branding issue. If we start saying these are actuarial risk principles when they're not really something new, we are going to lose our reputation, such as it is, and I don't think that's very good. I would like the board to consider the branding on this a bit more vigorously.
So I guess how I'd respond to that is, whilst they're branded as actuarial risk principles, I think it is clear that elements of those are done currently in certain areas. I think the difference is what we're saying is we're bringing it all together as a process and a framework within which there are particular actuarial skills within that framework, and you've pulled out a couple there of the principles that particularly apply, and encapsulating that as an entire framework and process is where we're bringing in the actuarial skill set where other people may just be doing elements and pieces of it. So I think I don't see that there's a big risk in saying, actually, as an actuary, we're coming along and thinking about it more holistically and as a whole process, and certain elements of it actually play significantly to our skill set as well as being able to capture the whole thing.
So I can only give you case studies, but we've been doing a bit of work through the Resource and Environment Board with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is very much trying to engage risk managers on sustainability issues, and with a sort of working party on climate risk between the British government and the Chinese government. And they definitely see that there's an actuarial skill set which risk management as a kind of wider community kind of don't have. And you picked up 5 and 6. For me, I think they're critical. So the range of outcomes, as opposed to that kind of point estimate, I think is vital. And the time horizon piece and that kind of challenge, because risk changes over that time horizon. So whether the whole process is kind of ARP, it should be branded actuarial, is a moot point, and I'll leave to others to discuss. But there is definitely a distinct process that I think actuaries do bring to risk management, which we should be emphasising.
Yeah, I was slightly concerned with the slides that we saw at the end of the presentations talking about how organisations can minimise the impact of the risk on them or whatever. I can't remember the exact wording, but it was fairly consistent wording. In some cases, if it's a good impact, you don't want to minimise. Risks don't necessarily always just have bad impacts. They can have good impacts too, often called opportunities. So is this actually was this thinking of the sort of duality, the risk and opportunity side, was this part of your thinking as you developed this? And if so, would you care to maybe think about how it can be brought out a bit more?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think so. Principle number 5, considering the full range of the possible outcomes, is intended to draw out some of the fact that there is not just a negative side to some of these things. There is the positive, and as mentioned earlier, it's inevitable that risk is taken in order to generate some sort of reward. So that is part of the structure as a whole. Perhaps some of the slides wording was focused primarily on looking at the downside part of things, but I think the principles as a whole should be capturing the idea that you are focusing on the whole system and the whole range of what might occur, and that's another area where we are actually bringing some actuarial skills to point out the benefits of some of these things that you could be doing.
Hi. I think as marketing documents for the actuarial profession, I think these documents are great, and I absolutely believe that there's so much that actuaries can contribute to risk management. But my concern is that it really doesn't emphasise the limitations enough, and that these principles will not work for every kind of circumstances. I think the only explicit mention of limitations I heard in the presentation was when Jaswir was talking about models, building models. But I think the limitations begin a long time before then. For instance, there's the traditional split between risk and uncertainty, where risk are the ones where which are susceptible to statistical analysis, but you're always going to have the unknowns, which are the black swans and the Donald Rumsfeld known unknowns, etc. And I think there are other distinctions. For instance, there are some risks that can be measured, and there are risks that can't be measured, although they can perhaps still be managed. And there are other risks where, Jaswir showed the traditional frequency against impact plot, where the classic example is hurricanes in the Caribbean, where you can have a very good idea of the frequency, but the difficult part is the impact, because it depends on whether they make landfall and where they make landfall. So I think the approach actually should be taking is firstly to be much more explicit about articulating the limitations of what we can do, and also there's explaining the scope for pooling risks, which is something that we have a lot of experience in.
I agree with all the points you made. I mean, I guess I started by saying I wasn't involved in the creation of these, but the point I wanted to say was actually applying them in practice to the example I gave there of autonomous vehicles. I found it quite a useful framework to just sort of get my head around and organise my thoughts. So I'd agree exactly with the points you make. I just think there is some merit in the framework itself as well for practitioners, just to organise their thoughts and start to get into some of those issues. But I agree those things should be borne in mind.
Yep.
No, I agree with both of what you just said. I come from a similar position in terms of Kevin, in terms of like I haven't actually been involved in developing the actuarial risk principles. So for me, it's all about looking at the principles and seeing how they fit in with cyber risk. Now, with many operational risks, you start off with a thought of, okay, we need to now consider cyber risk. How do we even start? How do we even know where to begin in terms of quantifying or managing the risk? And so when I was looking at the principles, I thought they provided a nice framework just to make sure you're capturing all the different elements that you should be thinking about. And so from that perspective, I definitely can see some benefit of using the principles, but I also agree about how you should be emphasizing also the limitations of such an approach.
I agree with all of that, and I think what you'll find is if you read through the whole document, the introduction sort of explains that this is not meant to encapsulate everything, and there are limitations around it. So part of the process is understanding, okay, what can this help you with? What are the things that sit outside that, and where else? What other elements of a risk management process sits around this to capture some of those other things? But it's a good point.
Yeah. I think the risk versus uncertainty point for me is something that, again, actuaries probably understand implicitly, but it does depend on what sector you're in. I think if I look back at the financial crisis, I think we didn't think there was a thing called uncertainty in mortgages. We mistook all of that kind of range of non-knowledge about the future for risk as opposed to uncertainty. What I was talking about in climate risk, it's all really climate uncertainty, right? There's no data on the past. So probably the whole industry has a taxonomy issue around that. The other area that I think we need to develop further is the difference between risk as in I've got a pool of assumably identical different agents who, so like motor insurance, who there's a certain frequency likelihood that they have an accident, and when you pool and aggregate that feels like risk, versus we have one experiment with the planet Earth. We can't, I was at the life insurance board to talk about, well, how do you do a Solvency II test on climate risk? And they said, we need 200 Earths. And of course we can't have that. So we kind of need to develop that uncertainty language and kind of bring it into the actuarial science. And I think at the moment it's kind of implicit, and we need to make that more explicit. I fully agree.
Okay, probably the last questions we've just run over.
Sorry, I'm not read the document. Also, good job the chap behind me's left. So I am quite interested in these actuarial principles in the sense of when I came to this thinking it was all going to be about model building, and then I come away from it thinking actually it's not really about model building, it's about exploring where the risks are and helping to inform what that future might look like, rather than just building the model to. So for example, an example of investment risk, somebody else built it, all those rocket scientists built it, and then the actuarial profession tried to understand it. Well, really what we're saying here is we're trying to build the environment in the first place. So it's a bit of an eye-opener for me anyway. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Okay, just quickly one last one then.
Thank you, Matt. I'm Alex Duncan. I'm the Chief Risk Officer at Just. First, I'd like to congratulate you on producing these principles, which have provoked a sort of very energetic discussion, but also which I do think will provide a useful framework for people for some aspects of risk management. I'd echo the comments about branding and the potential external impact. I'd be interested in the risk analysis you've done on considering taking this out, and what the upsides and the downsides are, or indeed contributing to it if that's still on the to-do list. I would also echo the fact that I think in some places the limitations of the methods are not clear enough. We talk about bias. Assumption is a big one. Nico, you said you were told that markets are efficient. I think that in itself is an assumption to make somebody else in maths work elsewhere. I don't think anybody's told us markets are efficient yet. I certainly wouldn't believe you if you told me. I'm very pleased to see recognition of the need for external expertise. I think that could be made more prevalent. Kevin's discussion pointed out there's not just external expertise of the content matter that we need, but also external expertise in how to think, particularly about the future. So having people who are experts in imagining the unimaginable in the future is extremely helpful in risk management. And then I see, together with this,
this framework as a useful tool inside the profession to help us organise our thoughts and our processes. I think there's a lot of opportunity here to work on the how-tos. So how do you get a group of people together to describe the system? Where do you get them from? What sort of format do you take them through that avoids bias? So in our day jobs, those of us working in risk management, operational risk management, run workshops where we structure them to try and remove bias in the conversations of what will happen. So there's knowledge out here within the profession that could help develop the how-tos around that. And I think that was all I wanted to say, but again, to congratulate you. Thank you.
Thank you. Just picking up on your first point there about the risk assessment for going out more broadly with this, that actually fits in quite well. You'll get the normal survey round after this event feedback on what we've discussed here, but alongside that we're also including an additional questionnaire which will ask some of these questions about whether you see this being useful elsewhere, how we might present that. So there will be an opportunity to provide some input and feedback on that area. Touching on a couple of the other points you made, it's an interesting question about how much detail we try and go into with a document like this. So the decision that the Risk Management Board took was to keep this quite short and brief and pull out the high level ideas, and not try and go into a lot of the detail and some of the specifics and drawing out too much around other elements of the limitations or other things. And there is a balance here to decide upon whether that approach is providing enough, whether it should be supported with additional guidance as to what some of these things mean, other areas that we should draw out. We're very conscious that there is a lot of risk management information out there already, and so this isn't trying to reinvent any of that or replace any of that. It's trying to come alongside the kind of information that's already out there and the things that actuaries in general should already be aware of: understanding model risk, understanding limitations, and the general approach to advice. But it's a good challenge as to whether or not that balance is right at the moment. So thank you for that. Did anybody else?
Can I'll just pick up on efficient markets without trying to go on too much of a polemic, because anyone who knows me knows it's a topic close to my heart. So I have been told that markets are efficient, and we should both be shocked by that. But there is unfortunately a kind of schizophrenia within investment consulting, and I won't necessarily blame actuaries, where you have strategy consultants who treat that assumption as truth and go off and build portfolios. And then you have manager researchers who go, of course markets are inefficient, because otherwise why on earth would you go and try and be an active manager? We seem to lose those nuances when it comes to sometimes advising the client. And almost exactly the same point that Matt was making, we do need to simplify our message to make sure that some of it gets through, because otherwise as brainy people we can just drown people in lots of two-handed economic type stuff. But yes, no, I think we all know that markets are not efficient, but there is a section of the people who essentially have actuarial qualifications, or certainly are in that discipline, who treat it as such an axiom that they maybe don't challenge it. So something for us all to remember about the limitations of our own knowledge, I suspect.
Okay, just remains for me then to thank our three speakers here for their case studies.